Ever feel like doing the right thing can get kind of complicated?
Yeah, definitely.
Well, get ready, because today we're diving into a world where right and wrong get seriously blurry.
We're talking psychotherapy and the ethical dilemmas that come with it.
We've got excerpts from Ethical Dilemmas in Psychotherapy to guide us.
And trust me, this isn't just for therapists.
Right. This stuff pops up everywhere.
Yeah.
Like, think about the whole do no harm oath
Sounds simple enough.
until you have to choose between two harms.
Exactly. That's where things get really interesting.
The book calls these prima facie duties obligations that seem straightforward on the surface.
Until they clash.
Imagine you're a therapist and your patient reveals they're planning to harm someone.
Oh, wow.
Confidentiality is huge in therapy,
Right.
but so is protecting others.
How do you even begin to balance those competing duties?
Talk about a rock and a hard place.
No easy answers there, that's for sure.
You want to help your patient, but also prevent harm.
Exactly why this book dives into positive ethics.
Positive ethics. Tell me more.
It's not enough to just avoid doing the wrong thing. You have to actively aim for the best possible outcome.
So it's not just about showing up. You're going for the gold medal in ethical conduct.
Exactly. And the book gives us a roadmap for how to do that. It lays out a 5-step decision-making model that psychologists use to navigate these ethically murky waters.
5 steps. Okay, break it down for me.
First, you have to pinpoint the problem. What's the core ethical issue at the heart of this situation?
Okay, so really define the problem.
Exactly. Then you brainstorm options. But here's the key. Don't jump to solutions just yet.
So really explore the possibilities before making a move.
Exactly.
What's next?
Step 3 is where you analyze those options. Weigh the pros and cons of each one, keeping in mind the ethical principles in play.
So really thinking it through carefully, not just reacting on instinct.
Exactly.
I like it. Okay, what about steps 4 and 5?
Well, step 4 is where you finally take action. You choose a path based on your analysis and put it into practice. But it doesn't end there.
Oh, there's more. Ethical homework.
You could say that. Step 5 is all about looking back and evaluating the outcome of your decision.
Did it work? What could have been done differently?
Exactly. It's about learning and growing from every experience, even the tough ones.
That makes a lot of sense. We learn from our mistakes.
Absolutely.
But even with a solid plan, even experts can make mistakes.
We're only human. Right.
So true. So how do we keep ourselves in check?
Well, the book points out that even with the best intentions, we can be tripped up by unconscious biases.
Biases, like what?
Well, one example is loss aversion. The tendency to feel the pain of a loss more strongly than the joy of a gain.
So we're more afraid of losing something than excited about gaining something of equal value.
Exactly. And this can even influence therapists who are trained to be objective.
That's a bit scary, isn't it?
It can be. Imagine a therapist facing a lawsuit. They might make decisions based on fear of financial loss, even if it means not acting in their patient's best interest.
Wow. That's a powerful example of how biases can cloud our judgment.
It happens more often than you might think.
So how can therapists, and really all of us, work to overcome those biases?
That's where consultation comes in. Just like you might get a second opinion from a doctor, psychologists often consult with each other.
To get a fresh perspective.
Exactly. Bouncing ideas off of a trusted colleague can help us check our own biases and make sure we're not missing something crucial.
So it's like having an ethical sounding board. Someone to help you see the bigger picture.
Precisely. 2 heads are often better than 1, especially with something this important.
It's like what we're doing right now for our listeners.
There you go.
Providing different perspectives and insights to help them navigate those ethically gray areas we all face.
Now, beyond reacting to ethical dilemmas as they come up, the book emphasizes a more proactive approach. It's called the Quality Enhancement Model.
The quality enhancement model. So instead of just putting out fires, you're building good habits from the get-go to prevent them in the first place. I like it. So how does this model work?
Well, it involves 2 types of strategies: distal strategies and proximal strategies.
Okay, so distal and proximal. Break those down for me.
Think of distal strategies as the long game. They're the habits and practices that form a strong ethical foundation for everything you do.
Okay, so the groundwork.
Exactly.
And what about proximal?
Those are your in-the-moment tools, the things you can do when you're right there in the thick of a challenging situation.
So distal is like building a strong ethical core.
Yes.
And proximal is like having a toolkit to pull from when things get tough.
Perfect analogy. Now let's dive into some specific examples, shall we?
Absolutely. I'm ready.
Okay, so one important distal strategy is ongoing learning. It's about staying up to date on the latest research, best practices, ethical guidelines.
Basically, being a lifelong learner in your field.
Exactly. Things change so quickly, you got to stay current.
That makes a lot of sense. You don't want to be relying on outdated information when you're making crucial decisions.
Yes.
What's another example of a distal strategy?
This one's especially important in a field like therapy. It's emotional competence.
Emotional competence. So being aware of and managing your own emotions.
Precisely. Therapists deal with some heavy stuff day in and day out. They need to be able to handle their own stress, practice self-care.
Otherwise, they'll burn out.
Exactly. You can't pour from an empty cup. Therapists need to be at their best to help their patients be at their best.
So emotional competence is crucial. Okay, what about those in-the-moment proximal strategies? Give me an example.
One that comes to mind is the 4-session rule.
The 4-session rule. What's that?
It's a way for therapists to check in with themselves and with the therapy process early on. It's about systematically assessing progress.
Within the first 4 sessions.
Exactly.
Interesting. So it's like a built-in checkpoint.
Exactly. It helps to catch any red flags early on and make sure the therapy is on track.
What a great example of a practical tool that can make a big difference. Are there other proximal strategies that therapists use?
Absolutely. Another important one is empowered collaboration.
Empowered collaboration.
So
So it's about working with the patient, not just doing things to them.
exactly. It's about actively involving patients in decisions about their own care, respecting their autonomy and right to make choices.
So it's a two-way street.
Exactly. Now, there are times when a patient's judgment might be impaired or they might be making choices that could be harmful. That's when things get really complicated, ethically speaking.
Okay, so how do therapists navigate those situations?
It's about finding that balance between respecting the patient's autonomy and ensuring their safety and well-being.
That must be an incredibly tough line to walk.
It is. And it's just one example of the many ethical challenges that therapists face on a regular basis.
It's like walking a tightrope sometimes. But that's why we're here.
Exactly.
To unpack these complex issues, learn from the experts, and equip ourselves to make more ethical choices in our own lives.
Now you're getting it. You know what I find really interesting?
What's that? This book doesn't just focus on those big, dramatic ethical dilemmas.
Right.
It's also about those everyday choices, the small decisions that add up over time.
It's about weaving those ethical threads into everything we do.
Exactly. Making ethical conduct a part of who we are, not just a set of rules we follow.
It's like building ethics into our DNA as professionals. And that's where this whole idea of ethics acculturation comes in.
Okay, acculturation.
Yeah.
That makes me think of adapting to a new culture.
Exactly. It's that same blending process.
How so?
Well, think about someone moving to a new country. They bring their own values and beliefs, right?
Right.
But they also have to learn the norms and expectations of this new culture.
So it's about finding a way to honor who you are while also adapting to a new environment.
Exactly. And professionals go through that same process with ethics. We all have our own personal moral compass.
Right. Our own sense of right and wrong.
But then we enter a profession with its own set of ethical standards and guidelines.
So it's about figuring out how those two things fit together.
Exactly. And the book breaks down different ways that people approach this process. Some folks reject both their own values and the professional standards. It's like they're ethically adrift, unsure of what they believe or how to act.
That sounds like a recipe for trouble.
It can be. Then there are those who cling tightly to their own values but completely disregard the professional ones.
So they're playing the game but refusing to follow the rules.
Exactly. It can lead to a lot of conflict and tension. Then you have those who go all in on the professional standards, but in doing so, they end up losing sight of their own moral compass.
So they're following the rules so rigidly that they lose their own sense of what's right.
Precisely. It's like they've assimilated into the profession's ethics, but haven't quite integrated them in a way that feels authentic.
So what's the ideal approach?
Integration. It's about finding that sweet spot where your own values and the ethical standards of your profession work together in harmony.
It's about bringing those two worlds together.
Exactly. And the book actually gives some really helpful advice on how to make that happen.
Like what I'm all ears, because I think that's something we all struggle with.
Absolutely. It's a lifelong process. But one important step is to really get to know yourself, your values, your beliefs, your limits.
Self-awareness is key.
It's essential. And then really dive into those ethical codes and guidelines for your profession. Don't just skim them. Wrestle with them, discuss them with colleagues.
So active engagement,
Hmm.
not just passive learning.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask for help along the way. Find mentors, supervisors, colleagues. You can trust people who can offer guidance and support as you navigate these complex issues.
Because we don't have to figure this out on our own.
Exactly. We're in this together.
I love that. Now, going back to therapy specifically, I want to circle back to the idea of respecting patient decisions, because on the surface, it seems pretty straightforward, right?
You'd think so, but it can get surprisingly complicated.
How so?
Well, what happens when a patient refuses a treatment that the therapist believes is crucial for their well-being?
Ooh, that's a tough one. You want to honor their autonomy, but you also don't want to see them suffer.
It's a delicate balance, for sure. The book really emphasizes the importance of informed consent.
Informed consent, meaning,
Making absolutely sure that patients have all the information they need to make truly informed choices about their own care.
so it's about empowering them to be active participants in their own treatment, but within reason, right?
Exactly. But even then, there are times when a patient's judgment might be impaired, or they might be making choices that could put themselves or others at risk. And that's where things get even more ethically murky.
So there are limits to this autonomy.
In a way, yes. Sometimes intervention is necessary, even if it means going against the patient's initial wishes.
Wow, that takes courage for a therapist to do.
It does. It's about weighing the potential risks and benefits, considering the patient's capacity to make sound decisions, and ultimately prioritizing their well-being.
It's about finding that balance between respecting their autonomy and acting in their best interests, even when those two things seem at odds.
Exactly. And that's why this framework that the book provides is so valuable. It gives therapists a way to think through those complex situations and make the most ethical decision possible.
So it's not about having all the answers. It's about having a process for finding the best possible answers in those difficult situations.
Exactly. And that's something we can all apply to our own lives.
I love that. And speaking of tough situations, let's talk about boundaries.
Ah, yes, boundaries. Always a hot topic.
We touched on this earlier with the difference between boundary crossings and boundary violations.
Right. It's an important distinction.
Could you give us a little refresher on that? Because it's one of those things that's easy to misunderstand.
Absolutely. So a boundary crossing is like a little detour from the usual way of doing things.
Okay. A slight deviation from the norm.
Exactly. And it might even be appropriate or helpful depending on the situation.
So it's about using your professional judgment to decide what's okay.
Exactly. A good example is attending a patient's wedding.
Really. That's allowed.
It's not ideal, and it's something that should be carefully considered. But in some cases, it might be a harmless boundary crossing that actually strengthens the therapeutic relationship.
Interesting. But there's a big difference between that and a boundary violation.
Huge. A boundary violation is a hard no. It's a serious breach of trust that can damage the therapeutic relationship and potentially harm the patient.
So give me some examples of what not to do.
We're talking sexual relationships with patients, revealing confidential information, using your position for personal gain. Those are all major ethical violations.
Yikes. Those are definitely lines you don't cross. And I'm guessing the book gives some real-world examples of these situations, because sometimes it's helpful to see how these things play out in real life.
Absolutely. It goes into the complexities of multiple relationships, those situations where a therapist might be connected to a patient in more than one way.
Ooh, I bet that gets complicated fast. Like what?
Imagine being a therapist and also being your patient's neighbor or their child's teacher or even their business partner.
Oh, wow. Talk about awkward. And ethically tricky, right?
It can be a minefield.
So how do you navigate something like that?
Well, the ideal is to avoid these multiple relationships whenever possible, but in some communities, particularly smaller ones, it's not always avoidable.
Right, you might run into your patient at the grocery store.
Exactly. So in those cases, it's all about proceeding with extreme caution.
So what does that look like practically?
Transparency is key. Having open and honest conversations with the patient about the potential conflicts of interest, getting their informed consent to proceed with the therapy despite the multiple relationship.
So making sure everyone is on the same page from the start.
Exactly. And setting very clear boundaries around each role. And, of course, seeking supervision from a trusted colleague to get an outside perspective.
So don't try to go it alone.
Exactly. Now, another tricky situation that can arise is when the therapist feels like it's time to end the therapy, but the patient isn't ready to stop.
Ooh, yeah. I imagine that could be tough on everyone involved.
It can be emotionally charged.
So how do therapists navigate that ethically?
Well, first and foremost, the therapist needs to have a valid clinical reason for ending the therapy.
Not just because they're feeling burnt out or something.
Exactly. There needs to be a solid clinical justification, and then it's all about how they handle the termination process.
So sensitivity is key.
Absolutely. The therapist needs to communicate the decision to the patient in a way that is compassionate, respectful, and understandable.
So they feel heard and understood, even though they might not like the decision.
Precisely. And, of course, the therapist needs to be mindful of the patient's well-being throughout the process and offer appropriate referrals if needed.
So even though the professional relationship is ending, their commitment to the patient's well-being doesn't just disappear.
Exactly. It's about ensuring a smooth and ethical transition for the patient.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, we've talked about respecting patient autonomy, but there's also the other side of the coin, the duty to protect, when a patient might pose a danger to themselves or others.
That's one of the heaviest ethical dilemmas a therapist can face.
Because it's confidentiality versus safety, and those are both so important.
Absolutely. It's a delicate balancing act. The book does a great job of breaking down the factors that therapists need to consider when facing these incredibly difficult decisions.
Like what?
Well, they have to assess the nature of the threat.
Is it a credible threat?
Exactly. Is the patient actually capable of carrying it out? And if so, what's the level of risk to themselves or others? They also have to be aware of the legal and ethical guidelines for reporting.
Because in some cases, therapists are legally obligated to report certain threats.
Exactly. It can be a real legal and ethical minefield. And there are often no easy answers.
It sounds incredibly stressful.
It can be. That's why documentation is so crucial in these situations.
Documentation, meaning
Keeping thorough and accurate records of everything.
their assessments of the threat, the decisions they made, the actions they took.
Everything. So that there's a clear paper trail, just in case.
Yeah. A paper trail to back up those tough calls if they're ever questioned.
Exactly. Now, working with children and adolescents adds a whole other layer of ethical complexity.
Oh, I bet. What are some of the unique challenges there?
Well, for starters, you're not just dealing with one person's rights and well-being. You've got to consider the child or adolescent's best interests while also respecting the rights of their parents or guardians.
It's like a balancing act on a tightrope.
That's a great way to put it. Therapists have to be really mindful of developmental differences, too.
Because a 5-year-old is going to have different needs and abilities than a 15-year-old.
Exactly. And confidentiality works a lot differently when you're working with minors.
So how does the book guide therapists in those situations?
It emphasizes the importance of clear communication and informed consent.
So making sure both the child and the parents understand the limits of confidentiality.
Exactly. And it provides guidance on when and how to report suspected abuse or neglect, which can be a really tough call.
Because you want to protect the child, but you also don't want to overstep boundaries or damage the therapeutic relationship.
It's a delicate balance, for sure. And speaking of ethical considerations beyond individual patients, the book also delves into the intersection of social justice and therapy.
Social justice.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that everyone deserves access to high-quality mental health care, regardless of their background or identity.
I love that.
And it challenges therapists to use their expertise to advocate for social justice, both within the field of psychotherapy and in the world at large.
This is about recognizing those systemic barriers that might prevent certain groups from getting the help they need.
Exactly. And then working to break down those barriers to create a more just and equitable world for everyone.
It's about using your privilege and your platform to make a difference.
Absolutely. Now, shifting gears a bit, the book also tackles some of those more practical ethical dilemmas that therapists face, like accepting gifts from patients.
Oh, that's an interesting one, because on one hand, it's a kind gesture, but on the other hand, it could be seen as a conflict of interest.
Exactly. And the book offers helpful guidelines for navigating those murky waters.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, one key principle is to always consider the patient's best interests.
So if accepting a gift might compromise the therapy in any way,
Then it's probably best to politely decline. And the same goes for bartering for services.
bartering like, I'll give you a free massage if you give me a free therapy session.
Exactly. It might seem harmless on the surface, but it can create all sorts of ethical dilemmas.
So the book helps therapists navigate those tricky financial arrangements ethically.
Exactly. Now, with technology becoming increasingly integrated into our
It's
lives,
a whole new world of ethical considerations, right?
absolutely. And the book dives into some really interesting dilemmas that have come up in recent years. Like what happens when a therapist Googles their patient?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I can see both sides of that coin.
Exactly. On one hand, a quick internet search could give the therapist some helpful context, but on the other hand, it could be seen as a violation of the patient's privacy.
So where do you draw the line?
Well, the book emphasizes the importance of transparency and informed consent.
So talking to your patients about your internet policies before you do any online sleuthing.
Exactly. And of course, maintaining confidentiality in electronic communications is just as important as it is in person.
Right. You can't just be emailing patient information willy-nilly.
Exactly. And speaking of things that are essential for ethical practice but often overlooked, self-care.
Ah, yes, self-care.
Yeah.
So important for everyone, but especially for therapists.
It's not just about bubble baths and face masks. It's about recognizing that you can't pour from an empty cup.
Love that analogy.
Therapists need to take care of their own well-being, physically, emotionally, mentally, in order to be fully present and effective for their patients.
It's like those distal strategies we talked about earlier, the long game. Taking care of yourself is an investment in your ability to do this work ethically and sustainably.
Exactly. Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground here today, from big picture ethical models to those really specific nitty-gritty dilemmas.
It's been eye-opening, and I think the biggest takeaway for me is just how complex this all is.
It really is. There are so many nuances and gray areas.
But I feel strangely empowered by this conversation.
Oh, so.
Because it's easy to get overwhelmed by all the things that could go wrong, all the ethical pitfalls out there.
Right.
But this book and our conversation today, it's not about scaring us into being ethically perfect. It's about giving us tools and frameworks to navigate these complex situations thoughtfully and proactively.
Exactly. It's about approaching ethical dilemmas with a sense of curiosity, humility, and a willingness to learn and grow along the way. And that's something we can all benefit from.
This book doesn't shy away from the tough stuff. Like, it even talks about when a therapist might need to admit they're in over their head.
It's true. And that can be a really tough thing for therapists to do. But it's a crucial part of ethical practice. Recognizing your own limits, knowing when to refer a patient to someone with more specialized expertise.
It's about putting the patient's needs first, even if it means admitting you're not the best fit for them.
Exactly. There's a lot of humility in that. And it's another area where consultation is so important.
Makes sense. Getting that second opinion, bouncing ideas off a trusted colleague, it can really help you see the situation more clearly.
Absolutely. And it can give you the confidence to make those tough calls when you need to.
Oh.
Speaking of tough calls, the book also talks about pro bono work.
Oh, yeah. Offering therapy for free or at a reduced rate. It's a wonderful thing to do.
Yeah.
But I imagine there are some ethical considerations there too, right?
For sure. You want to make sure you're not creating a situation where you're overextending yourself or burning yourself out.
Right, because that wouldn't be good for the therapist or the patient.
Exactly. The book really encourages therapists to examine their motivations for offering pro bono services.
Like, why are they doing it? Are they coming from a place of genuine generosity, or is it more about, I don't know, trying to save everyone?
Precisely. And it emphasizes the importance of establishing really clear boundaries around pro bono work so that it's sustainable, not just something you do for a few months and then give up on because you're exhausted.
It's about pacing yourself, knowing your limits.
Exactly. And making sure that it's something you can offer consistently without compromising the quality of care you're providing.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, I've got to ask about those situations where someone might be hinting that they need help, but not directly asking for it. The book calls them indirect cries for help.
Right. It's a really interesting ethical dilemma.
Like, what if a therapist overhears a conversation at a dinner party and someone is talking about their anxiety or their depression?
Exactly. What do you do with that? On the one hand, they're clearly struggling, and as a therapist, you want to help. But on the other hand, it wasn't a direct request for help, and you don't want to overstep boundaries or make them feel uncomfortable.
Right. You don't want to be that therapist who's analyzing everyone at a cocktail party.
Exactly. So the book offers guidance on how to navigate those situations really delicately and thoughtfully.
So, like, what do you do in that situation? You can't just ignore it, can you?
You have to use your judgment. But generally, it's about erring on the side of caution. Maybe finding a way to casually mention your profession, letting them know you're available if they ever want to talk. But ultimately, respecting their privacy and their right to seek help on their own terms.
It's about planting a seed, but not forcing them to water it.
Love that. That's a great way to put it.
Okay, this next one feels a bit heavier. What about when a patient's behavior is just morally wrong?
It definitely adds another layer of complexity.
Like, what if their actions go against the therapist's own values?
Yeah.
How do you reconcile your duty to help with your own sense of right and wrong?
That's a tough one, and there's no easy answer. The book really encourages therapists to take a long, hard look at their own biases and values.
To make sure those biases aren't impacting their ability to provide competent care.
Exactly. It also stresses the importance of consultation. Talking to colleagues, seeking supervision, it can really help you process those feelings and make sure you're not letting your own judgment get in the way of helping your patient.
It's about separating the person from the behavior.
Exactly. And recognizing that everyone is capable of change and growth.
That's a really important reminder. Now, what about when a patient engages in hate-filled speech? That must be so challenging for therapists to navigate.
It's incredibly difficult, but again, it's about setting those clear boundaries.
So letting the patient know that kind of language is not acceptable.
Exactly. But it's not just about shutting down the conversation. It's also about trying to understand what's behind it.
Where's all this hate coming from?
Exactly. What's driving this person to say these hurtful things? And how can we, as therapists, help them work through those underlying issues?
It's about challenging the hate, but not rejecting the human being who is expressing it.
Beautifully said. It's that nuance that's so important in this work.
And I imagine similar complexities come up around religion, right?
For sure. The therapist's own religious beliefs, the patient's religious beliefs, and it can get complicated. But at the end of the day, it comes back to that fundamental principle of doing no harm, respecting the patient's beliefs, even if they differ from your own, while also ensuring that those beliefs don't interfere with providing ethical and effective care.
It's about finding that balance, that sweet spot, where personal beliefs don't overshadow professional obligations.
Exactly. And that takes a lot of self-awareness, reflection, and ongoing dialogue.
It's a journey. And speaking of journeys, we've talked about so many different ethical dilemmas today, and I have to say, the one thing that keeps coming up again and again is the importance of documentation.
It's the backbone of ethical practice.
Break it down for me one last time. Why is it so important?
Well, on a practical level, it helps us keep track of what we're doing with each patient.
Right. Their progress, the interventions you've tried, all of that.
Exactly. But it also provides a space for us as therapists to reflect on our work.
So we can learn and grow from our experiences.
Precisely. But perhaps most importantly, documentation serves as evidence of our decision-making process, which can be absolutely crucial if ethical concerns or legal issues ever come up.
It's about protecting yourself, but also ensuring accountability and transparency.
Exactly. It's about creating a clear record of what happened, why you made the choices you made.
Wow. We've really covered a lot of ground today, from those big picture ethical models to the very specific dilemmas that therapists face on a daily basis. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It really has. But what I hope listeners take away from this is that even though these ethical dilemmas can feel incredibly daunting, even paralyzing at times, there are frameworks and resources to help guide therapists in those tough moments.
It's about having a process, a plan of attack.
Exactly. And it's about being proactive, being thoughtful, seeking consultation when you need it, and always putting the patient's best interests first.
And I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive into ethical dilemmas in psychotherapy.
It's been a pleasure.
The book really does an incredible job of shining a light on the complexities of this work. And it reminds us that ethical decision-making is an ongoing process.
It's not something you perfect overnight.
It's something you're constantly working on, learning from, refining.
And it's something that we as a profession need to be talking about more openly and honestly.
Absolutely. So to our listeners, if this conversation has sparked your curiosity, we encourage you to check out Ethical Dilemmas in Psychotherapy.
It's a fantastic resource.
And keep those conversations going. Talk to your friends, your colleagues, your therapist. Because the more we talk about these issues, the more prepared we'll be to navigate them ethically and compassionately. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.